Hello and welcome to this lesson on the Analytical Writing Assessment, or the GMAT essay, for the GMAT Graduate Business School exam. Now, as far as the essay goes overall, there's one essay task which is to evaluate an argument. It'll take you 30 minutes to consider the argument, write your essay, and then ultimately proof your essay. It is always going to be the first or final section in your variable exam order. So you can either begin with the AWA, then the integrated reasoning, then the quantitative and verbal sections, or you can choose quantitative or verbal first, then move into the integrated reasoning section after the other of quantitative or verbal, and then conclude with the essay. Now, the essay is going to be scored independently on a 0 to 6 scale in half-point increments. So you can get a 3.5, a 4.5, a 5.5. What's happening is you're going to have two independent graders. One may or may not be a computer program, and they will never deviate by more than a single point. They're not going to score you a half point, but if somebody gave you a 4 and then the other person gave you a 5, or the computer gave you a 5, you would average out to, say, a 4.5. Now, this is consistently the least important section of the GMAT for admissions consideration. The way you need to consider the GMAT essay is as a de facto TOEFL exam, which is the English as a foreign language requirement exam, and it is basically there to guarantee written language English proficiency. So the theory is that if somebody without English language proficiency were to write their admissions essay or essays in their native language and then pay someone to translate them, the admissions office cannot be aware of that. But for the GMAT essay, whoever is sitting for the exam has to prove identity, has to write this essay in 30 minutes, and has no assistance. So your goal is to just make sure that you hit the minimum, and the minimum is going to be a 5. So a 5 or higher, which is approximately the 55th percentile, is going to be a safe target score. In many cases, a 4.5 will even be a safe target score. But a 4 is going to put you right around the 20th percentile just because of the scoring curve. So you really do want to do your best to guarantee a 5 or above. And you really do that through what we're going to talk about here in this lesson. You execute on these tactics and processes, you should be able to produce a relatively rote 5-level essay. And as we talked about, this has to be either the beginning or the end. It can't come in the middle. So decide whether you prefer to have the integrated reasoning and the essay, as they do come as one segment of the exam, is approximately an hour in duration. Decide whether you'd prefer that as a warm-up for your exam or as a cool-down. So basically you have to decide, do I start slowly and need that warm-up, or does my attention lag and do I lose focus as I continue through the exam, in which case I probably just want this as a cool-down and I don't want to delay the pieces that matter more in the quantitative and verbal sections, and to a degree the integrated reasoning section. So then your essay task is always the same, and it is what is here on the left-hand side. So after they give you your little prompt, you're going to read, discuss how well reasoned you find this argument. In your discussion, be sure to analyze the line of reasoning and the use of evidence in the argument. For example, you may need to consider what questionable assumptions underlie the thinking and what alternative explanations or counterexamples might weaken the conclusion. You can also discuss what sort of evidence would strengthen or refute the argument, what changes in the argument would make it more logically sound, and what, if anything, would help you better evaluate its conclusion. Now that you've read the essay task, it will never change. You may never have to read it again. So just get familiar with this task as part of your preparation for the exam, and then on test day, you'll know exactly what you have to do, which is to just discuss how well-reasoned you find the argument. So you never have to read this, hopefully, now that you've just walked through it here in this video. So you basically consider the essay task as a long-form critical reasoning evaluation task. So evaluate the reasoning, not attack the reasoning, not offer alternative reasoning, and staying on task is very important as you try to guarantee that 5-level score that will be sufficient. So you will always have to first identify the main claim, conclusion, recommendation, or opinion that is requiring evaluation. So once we get into the prompt, that's your first job, is to find what the conclusion is. Read the paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs, but usually just 1 paragraph, understand what it's saying and what the specific recommendation or claim is. So again, you're not being asked to attack the claim, call it the worst essay or the worst argument ever. You want to avoid pejorative and hyperbole. You don't want to make those sorts of outlandish claims about how terrible this argument is, how it's just completely unfounded. There are surely some flaws, but you want to be measured in your response. And so you're going to then investigate ways that additional information pertaining to possible assumptions could both damage or improve the claim as you aim for a 6. So the way that that works is you want to not only say here are problems with the argument as it's presented, but also here are possible solutions, because those solutions show and illustrate a true understanding of the circumstances in the argument, different pieces of argumentation, and just shows a comprehensive overall understanding of what is happening in the little prompt that they've given you, and is really what they're looking for to attain that roughly top 10 percentile score of a 6. Now, also, avoid using outside information or personal bias in your evaluation. You really have to stick to the prompt. Don't go outside of it. That's one of, again, the only ways that you can deviate from the task and get yourself into the danger zone of going below a 5 is by going off on a tangent, talking about things that you are assuming everybody knows. And if you've got a topic that in particular you're familiar with, you just have to make sure that you're not sometimes using information that is not germane or that available to your grader. Remember that your grader is always going to be somebody who's reading this in somewhere between 2 to 5 minutes, probably closer to 2 minutes than 5, and they basically have a checklist making sure that you accomplish all the goals. And if it's a computer program, it's even more straightforward and streamlined. So just stick to the script. Don't deviate from it. Don't use outside information. Don't start incorporating possibilities or personal biases. Just address the information that they've given you. So as far as the pacing goes for the essay, you're always going to want to start with 3 to 5 minutes of brainstorming. And in the brainstorming, you first have to clearly identify what the main conclusion is in need of evaluation. You also want to identify major issues within the argument that would affect the viability of that conclusion. So is this sample size too small? Is this a causality that isn't necessarily anything except for correlation? So you're just going to identify as many different issues that need to be further evaluated per the task to determine the viability of the conclusion. Then you're going to spend about 22 to 25 minutes writing your essay. Assume a standard 4-paragraph structure. You're going to have an introduction, you're going to have your first support paragraph, you're going to have your second support paragraph, and you're going to go straight into your conclusion. This takes the guesswork out, and for whatever reason, a long time ago, it seems that many people got the idea you need a 5-paragraph essay, like in basic middle school, high school, even some undergraduate writing. Here, there's no need for a 5th paragraph. Take a paragraph out to guarantee that you'll have enough time to spend 2 to 3 minutes proofreading, because it is important to make sure that you catch any major errors in your logic. It's entirely possible in the construct of this essay task in 30 minutes to just leave out a sentence that was in your head and like is integral to what is happening in your essay. Also, you've got to make sure that you include things like what is the actual conclusion. Don't just refer to it obliquely as the conclusion over and over and over again. Your essay grader can't assume that you know what the conclusion exactly was. So you want to catch major errors in logic. You also want to fix convoluted phrasing. If English is not your first language, you can possibly just streamline and cut out extra words. Another thing that this exam does not do is give extra points for just the length of the essay. So you can try to streamline things, use active voice, be direct, be concise, be clear. It's kind of like sentence corrections in that way. And then you can also vary your word choice slightly. So you could just make sure that you're not saying the conclusion, the conclusion, the conclusion over and over and over again. You can also say the claim and do some different slight variations on word choice. But that is what you're going to do while you're working through the essay. So now we have a sample essay prompt here on the left-hand side, and you can see at the bottom of the screen there are additional prompts available at mba.com at that rather convoluted URL. Of course, that can change at any time, but they have provided the possible prompts for years. I do not recommend that you go and try to prepare all of them because, again, this is by far the least important part of your GMAT exam. But if you need a couple of practice essays, that's where you can get some prompts and do some practice for yourself. Now, we have this prompt. The following appeared as a part of an annual report sent to stockholders by Olympic Foods, a processor of frozen foods. Over time, the costs of processing go down because as organizations learn how to do things better, they become more efficient. In color film processing, for example, the cost of a 3 by 5 inch print fell from 50 cents for 5-day service in 1970 to 20 cents for 1-day service in 1984. The same principle applies to the processing of food, and since Olympic Foods will soon celebrate its 25th birthday, we can expect that our long experience will enable us to minimize costs and thus maximize profits. So the first thing we have to do is clearly articulate what the main conclusion is. And you can paraphrase slightly, but not a lot. You're really just shorthanding, and I would put this directly into the interface of the word processor because you can write around it after you've done your brainstorming. So you can see I shorthanded it potentially as OF Olympic Foods. So the main conclusion is just that since OF Olympic Foods will soon turn 25, it can be expected that experience will minimize costs and max profits. And I just focus on the conclusion. I don't want to grab any of the evidence. It's just that conclusion that I'm asked to evaluate. And by being more unbiased and disinterested with the evidence, it'll allow me to be better prepared to identify possible issues, such as, is the analogy to color film processing apt? Is there anything similar between Olympic Foods and color film processing? I personally don't know, and you don't want to make a value judgment to say absolutely not. You just want to say, is this analogy apt? We need to find out. Does a lowering of costs mean that we're going to maximize profits? Because it says that minimizing costs will allow us to maximize profits. And again, just because I drop cost, does that mean that revenue doesn't go down as well? So that's another inherent assumption that I've got to investigate. Is 25 years enough to qualify as long experience? I don't know. We're talking about something that happened from 1970 to 1984 in the example, the analogy, and that's 14 years. Obviously, more than that time has passed since then to now. So I need to find out, is that 25 years long enough to qualify as long experience as required potentially by this argument? Also, this is from the annual report sent to stockholders by Olympic Foods. This has a very positive outlook on Olympic Foods. Might it be biased? So this is a really easy kind of thing to note. Hey, maybe we need another source. And lastly, we've just got the idea of just because the principle applies in theory, does it work in practicality? So we're talking about this same principle about, we've got, as organizations learn how to do things better, they become more efficient. I mean, that seems like a rather kind of curt relationship. Just be like, yeah, it applies in theory. Okay, great. We need more information to determine if it will actually work in practicality. And all of this needs to take less than 5 minutes. And you're just typing these things directly into the word processor. So we keep the main conclusion up, and as I said, take the notes in the word processor for maximum efficiency. You'll then choose the top 3 issues or assumptions to evaluate in your essay. There's not enough time to go through everything, so you just got to streamline it down to the big 3. And here we'll go with whether or not that analogy to color film processing is apt. Is that 25 years enough to qualify as long experience? And is the annual report possibly biased? Simple enough. The other ones, they just fell by the wayside, but it's a personal decision. You just want to make it proactively so that you're not stream of conscious writing your essay. So let's talk about that essay structure now. It's always going to begin with an introduction. And in the introduction, explicitly identify your main conclusion. Don't skirt it. Don't overly paraphrase it. Don't just refer back to it as the claim or the conclusion or the recommendation. You have to say what it is, because sometimes they're a little bit convoluted and a little bit complex, and that's part of the thing that the essay grader is noting, is whether or not you specifically understood what the conclusion was. Then you want to preview your top 3 issues that you need to evaluate, and you'll transition into the primary issue that is in need of evaluation, whatever you decided, in this case, possibly whether or not that analogy to color film processing is apt for Olympic Foods. Then we go straight into our primary issue, first body paragraph. You're going to briefly summarize your issue and how it affects the viability. Don't need to go into too much detail. It should be pretty self-explanatory, and it's coming straight from the prompt. You're not using outside knowledge that needs further exposition. Then you're going to recommend some additional information sources and how the results of that information might improve or decrease the claim's viability. So, do we find out that there are actually a lot of ways that color film processing and food processing are similar? Maybe. And if that's the case, it improves the viability. Make sure you're not just addressing the con side, address the for side as well. And then you're going to transition into the second most pertinent issue that you've identified that needs further evaluation. And of course, the third paragraph, the second body paragraph, is going to be very similar to the first body paragraph, where we address the secondary issue in need of evaluation. So you're going to briefly summarize that issue and how it affected the viability. You'll then, once again, want to recommend additional information sources and how the results of that information might improve or decrease the claim's viability. Again, you can consider some vague hypotheticals that could, again, improve or decrease that viability of the claim. Things like, if we're considering that longevity of is 25 years enough time to become experienced, you could say, well, what if there are primary competitors that have more than 100 years of experience? What if the primary competitors have significantly fewer years of experience? You're not really bringing in outside information. You're just considering hypotheticals. That's a better way to go about it. Don't suddenly start going down a rabbit hole, though, on too many specifics. Like, we need to know about the CEO and how, what his experience has been within the exact sector of food processing and all these sorts of things. Keep it simple, but what you want to achieve is a breadth of coverage on several different topics. And then you're going to transition into the third most pertinent issue in need of evaluation, and that's going to be addressed directly in the conclusion. So I know I said I want 3 issues. Part of that is to make a conclusion that is a little bit more engaging. So you're going to briefly mention any additional issues also in need of evaluation. Again, bias is a great one to drop in right here, because it's really easy to just say, the source for this is the Olympic Foods stockholder report. Is that an unbiased, disinterested source? Is there anybody else that would agree with this claim? If the answer is yes, and it's there's a third-party mediator that has arbitrated the company for a while, and you're like, and they say that all these things are true, the argument seems better. But if there's no one else to back up the claim from this possibly biased source, that obviously decreases the viability. And then you're just going to close by restating your main claim of the argument as uncertain pending the results of seeking this additional information regarding the issues that you identified. So just saying, without answers to the questions that we raised, we don't know. And that is one other thing to note. Do not be against writing in first person. Just pick a consistent person as you write your essay. You can write it as an I. You can write it as a third person. Just be consistent in person. It's completely okay either way. So just concluding the process, step 1, brainstorm. Read the prompt to identify the main conclusion and address that static task that never changes. Identify the top 3 issues and assumptions affecting the conclusion's viability. Then after that 3 to 5 minute process, you're going to write your essay. Basic 4-paragraph structure, introduction, 2 body paragraphs of support, and then a conclusion. And try to allocate new information for that conclusion. Because when you do so, again, these are the sorts of things that are trying to push you up to a 5.5 or a 6, is just having more robust organization and narrative cohesion throughout the essay. And then step 3 is to proofread. Do make sure that you give enough time to try to catch those major errors and vary word choice slightly, because the downside to not proofing is way bigger than the upside of saving that extra 2 to 3 minutes to write an extra 2 to 3 sentences. Those extra 2 to 3 sentences won't really affect your essay score. But if you missed something or didn't write out what the actual conclusion was for whatever reason in the prompt or in your essay, and you miss that, that could have a really negative impact on your score. So now that you have an approach to write the analytical writing assessment essay for the GMAT, go ahead and pull up some prompts and write some practice essays on your own.